The rain fell in sheets across the Silver Moon Pack territory, turning the training grounds into a muddy wasteland that reflected the gray sky above. Lyra stood at the edge of the clearing, her thin frame shivering beneath the soaked fabric of her servant's tunic, watching as the younger wolves practiced their transformations under the critical eye of Beta Marcus. She was supposed to be cleaning the Alpha's residence, but she had been drawn here by some inexplicable pull, the same restless energy that had plagued her for weeks now. At 23, she should have been mated, should have held some position of respect within the pack hierarchy, but instead she remained the pack's shame, the Omega who couldn't complete her shift, whose wolf existed only as a flickering shadow beneath her skin, never fully emerging. The other wolves called her broken, defective, a waste of the moon goddess's gift. And after years of their scorn, Lyra had almost begun to believe them. She watched as 15-year-old Mira completed a flawless transformation, her gray wolf form sleek and powerful, and felt the familiar ache of inadequacy settle in her chest. Her own wolf stirred restlessly inside her, a presence she could feel but never fully become, as though some invisible barrier prevented the final metamorphosis. The pack healers had examined her countless times, declaring her wolf stunted, her Omega nature too weak to sustain a full transformation. Alpha Donovan had permitted her to remain in the pack only because discarding a pack member, even a defective one, would bring questions from the regional council. So instead she served, invisible and insignificant, cleaning and cooking, and pretending she didn't hear the whispered insults that followed her everywhere. If you're enjoying this story of ancient mysteries and forbidden awakenings, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have so many more supernatural romance tales to share with you. That evening, as Lyra scrubbed the stone floors of the pack house kitchen, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Elder Thomas was speaking with Beta Marcus in the adjoining dining hall, their voices carrying through the thin walls. They were discussing the upcoming new moon ceremony, a traditional event that Lyra usually ignored, because Omegas were not permitted to participate in the sacred rituals. But something Elder Thomas said made her pause, her hand stilling in the soapy water. He mentioned the old ruins at the northern border. The place pack members were forbidden to visit, saying that the Alpha had ordered the area sealed off permanently. Marcus asked why, and Thomas's response was hushed but clear. Because the ruins predated even the Silver Moon Pack itself, because they contained altars to the old gods, and because there were stories, dangerous stories, about what lay sleeping beneath those ancient stones. Marcus laughed it off as superstition, but something in Thomas's tone suggested he believed every word. Lyra felt her wolf surge with sudden interest, pressing against her consciousness with an urgency she had never experienced before, as though some part of her recognized something in the elder's words. 3 nights later, during the new moon when the pack's attention was focused on the ceremonial grounds near the Alpha's residence, Lyra found herself walking toward the forbidden ruins. She couldn't explain the compulsion that drew her there, only that her wolf seemed to be guiding her, pulling her forward with an insistence that overrode her fear of punishment. The ruins lay in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their stone structures half collapsed and covered in moss and creeping vines. In the center stood what remained of a circular temple, its pillars still supporting fragments of a domed roof, carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the darkness despite the absence of moonlight. Lyra approached slowly, her heart pounding, feeling as though she had stepped into a place that existed outside of normal time. The air felt different here, heavy with power and possibility, and her wolf was practically singing inside her, more present than she had ever felt it before. She found herself drawn to the center of the temple where an altar of black stone stood, its surface covered in intricate carvings that depicted wolves running beneath a full moon, and above them, a figure that seemed both wolf and man, crowned with lunar light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far more sophisticated than anything the Silver Moon Pack could produce. And as Lyra traced her fingers over the carved surface, she felt a strange warmth emanating from the stone. Words were carved around the base of the altar, in an ancient script she shouldn't have been able to read. But somehow the meaning came to her, as clearly as if they were written in modern language. Here lies the first Alpha, the moon's champion, sealed by divine will until the blood of the last. Priestess calls his name. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories of the first Alpha, but they were myths, legends told to cubs about the powerful king who had founded the werewolf traditions before recorded history. No one actually believed he had been real. Her hand slipped on the wet stone, and she felt a sharp pain as her palm scraped across a jagged edge, blood welling instantly from the cut. The crimson drops fell onto the altar, and the moment they touched the black stone, everything changed. The carved symbols began to glow with silver light, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Lyra stumbled backward, terror flooding through her as the entire temple seemed to come alive, power surging through the ancient stones like electricity through wires. She should have run, should have fled back to the pack grounds, but her wolf held her frozen in place, and before she could stop herself, she was reading aloud the name, carved at the center of the altar, the name that her blood had illuminated. Kyle. The moment the syllable left her lips, the world exploded in brilliant silver light that consumed everything, and Lyra felt herself falling, not physically, but spiritually, plummeting through layers of time and memory that weren't her own. Visions of battles and ceremonies, and a golden-eyed king who commanded storms themselves flooding through her consciousness. When the light faded, Lyra found herself on her knees, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling from the surge of power that had passed through her. For a moment, she thought nothing had happened, that perhaps she had triggered some ancient magical defense and been lucky to survive it. But then she heard the sound of stone grinding against stone, and she looked up to see the altar splitting down the center, the two halves sliding apart to reveal a space beneath, a chamber that should not have existed. From that darkness emerged a hand, and then an arm, and then a figure pulling itself up from impossible depths, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. The man who emerged from beneath the altar was the most magnificent being Lyra had ever seen. Easily 6.5 feet tall, with a powerful build that spoke of immense strength, his skin bronzed as though permanently kissed by sunlight, his hair a deep black that fell past his shoulders, but it was his eyes that stole her breath. Golden like molten amber, ancient and aware, and fixed directly on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Please don't forget to like this video if you're captivated by Lyra and Kale's story. Your support means everything to us. The man stood in the center of the broken altar, looking around the ruined temple with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that might have been grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying a weight of authority that made Lyra's wolf immediately want to submit, though some stubborn part of her resisted the urge. He spoke in the old language, the same archaic dialect carved into the stones, but Lyra found she could understand him perfectly, as though some connection formed by the ritual had granted her comprehension. He asked where he was, what year it was, how long he had been sealed, and the desperation underlying his controlled tone suggested he already feared the answers. Lyra tried to respond, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, and she had to clear her throat twice before she could force out words, telling him this was the Silver Moon Pack territory, that the year was 2024, that she didn't know how long he had been imprisoned, but the ruins were considered ancient, even by the Pack's oldest members, suggesting at least 1,000 years had passed. Kyle's reaction was subtle but devastating. His powerful frame seemed to sag slightly, his golden eyes closing as though absorbing a physical blow, and when he opened them again, there was a profound sadness in their depths that made Lyra's heart ache with sympathetic pain. He asked about the lunar priestesses, about the sacred temples, about the old laws that had governed werewolf society, and with each question, Lyra could only shake her head, admitting she had never heard of priestesses beyond myths, that the temples were ruins or forgotten, that the laws were now whatever each alpha decreed for their territory. She watched something die in his expression with each answer, watched him realize that everything he had known, Everyone he had loved, every structure he had built, had been erased by the relentless passage of time. He turned away from her then, walking to the edge of the temple to stare out at the dark forest. And Lyra saw his hands clench into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with the effort of maintaining control over emotions she couldn't begin to imagine. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, asking her name and why she had awakened him. Lyra explained haltingly about being drawn to the ruins, about the blood and speaking his name, about not meaning to break whatever seal had held him. She admitted she was nobody important, just a defective Omega who couldn't even shift properly, that she had no idea why the altar had responded to her. Kyle turned back to her at that, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm, and she watched his nostrils flare slightly as he scented the air between them. His expression shifted to something like shock, and he moved toward her with supernatural speed that left her no time to retreat, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He told her she was no defective Omega, that the power he sensed sleeping inside her was unlike anything he had felt in centuries, that her wolf was not weak but caged, sealed by magic she clearly didn't understand. And then he said something that made Lyra's world tilt on its axis. He told her she carried the bloodline of the lunar priestesses, the sacred line he had spent his life protecting, and that she was quite possibly the last of her kind. The implications crashed over Lyra like a tidal wave. Everything she had been told about herself, every insult and dismissal, every moment of shame and inadequacy, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was. She wasn't broken. She was bound. Her true nature locked away by magic whose purpose she couldn't fathom. Kyle seemed to read the chaos in her expression, because his own features softened slightly, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, before placing his hand gently on her shoulder. The moment his skin made contact with hers, even through the fabric of her tunic, Lyra felt a surge of recognition so profound, it nearly brought her to her knees, her wolf howling with joy inside her consciousness, pushing against its invisible cage with renewed desperation. She looked up into Kale's face and saw her own shock reflected there, saw the moment he realized what she was to him, and heard the single word that escaped his lips like a prayer and a curse combined: mate. The bond snapped into place between them like a physical thing, a golden thread that connected her soul to his, and Lyra felt tears streaming down her face because how could the universe be so cruel as to give her a mate who came from an age long dead, a king without a kingdom, separated from her by 1,000 years of lost time. Cal pulled his hand back as though burned, putting distance between them, and Lyra could see him struggling with the same overwhelming emotions that threatened to drown her. He explained in a voice rough with feeling that mate bonds were sacred, permanent, that they couldn't be ignored or dismissed, but that he understood if she rejected him, because what could he offer her now? A relic from a dead age, with nothing but memories of a world that no longer existed. Lyra surprised herself by laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed through the ruins, and she pointed out that she was the pack's outcast, considered worthless and defective, that if anything he should be rejecting her because what kind of mate was too weak to even shift. They stared at each other across the broken altar, two beings the world had discarded, both convinced they had nothing to offer, and something about the absurdity of the situation made Kyle's stern expression crack, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable and devastating in an entirely different way. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Lyra and Kale can bridge the 1,000 years between them? The practical reality of the situation asserted itself quickly. Kale needed information about this new world, needed to understand what had become of the society he had once ruled, and Lyra needed to get them both away from the ruins before a patrol discovered them. She offered to take him to her small cabin on the outskirts of Pack territory, a dwelling given to her precisely because it was so far from the main compound that no one would notice or care about her visitors. Kyle agreed, but as they prepared to leave the temple, he paused at the altar, running his fingers over the broken stone with an expression of profound sorrow. He explained that he had been sealed here by the combined power of the old gods and the priestesses, a sacrifice he had chosen to prevent a curse from destroying his people, that he was supposed to sleep until the curse had run its course, and the world was ready for the old ways to return. The fact that he had awakened now, called by Lyra's blood, suggested that either the time had finally come or something had gone terribly wrong with the original magic. Either way, his awakening would have consequences that neither of them could yet predict. The walk to Lyra's cabin took nearly an hour, following deer paths and avoiding the main trails where pack patrols might spot them. Kyle moved through the forest with an ease that spoke of centuries of experience, his senses clearly far sharper than any modern werewolf Lyra had encountered, and she found herself fascinated by the way he would occasionally stop to touch a tree or examine a plant, his expression distant, as though comparing what he saw to memories of how the forest had once looked. When they finally reached her small dwelling, little more than 2 rooms and a basic bathroom, Kale had to duck to enter through the doorway, and Lyra felt embarrassed by the humble space, wondering what a king must think of such meager accommodations. But Kyle simply looked around with interest, commenting that it reminded him of the simple huts warriors had used during long campaigns, that there was honor in functionality and self-sufficiency. His words eased something tight in Lyra's chest, and she busied herself starting a fire in the small hearth and putting water on to boil for tea. Normal domestic tasks that helped ground her in the face of the extraordinary situation. As they sat across from each other at her small table, steam rising from their cups, Lyra began asking the questions that had been building since his awakening. She wanted to know everything about the old world, about what life had been like when he ruled, about the lunar priestesses and their connection to the werewolf people. Kyle seemed grateful for the distraction from his grief, and he began to speak, his deep voice filling the cabin with stories of an age when werewolves had lived in harmony with the moon's cycles, when priestesses had served as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms, when the bonds between pack members had been built on mutual support rather than rigid hierarchy. He described a society where omegas were revered as the pack's heart, their empathic abilities and connection to lunar magic making them essential to the community's spiritual health, where alphas earned their positions through wisdom and service, rather than simply being born with strength and aggression. The world he painted was so different from everything Lyra knew that it seemed like pure fantasy. Yet the conviction in his voice, and the pain in his eyes when he spoke of what had been lost, convinced her that every word was true. She learned that Kale had been what was called a true alpha, the first of his kind, born with a direct connection to the moon itself that granted him abilities far beyond normal werewolves. He could command the change in others, could sense the emotions and intentions of anyone in his territory, could draw on the moon's power to heal wounds or devastate enemies. He had united the scattered wolf clans under a single banner, not through conquest, but through proving that cooperation created strength no rigid hierarchy could match. The lunar priestesses had been his partners in this work, using their magic to bind the clans together, to establish the mate bond as a sacred institution, to create the rituals and traditions that gave werewolf life meaning and structure. For 3 centuries, his reign had been a golden age, a time of peace and prosperity that seemed impossible to modern ears. But then the curse had come, a plague of madness that turned wolves feral, that destroyed the mate bond and left packs tearing themselves apart, and the priestesses had determined that the only way to stop it was to seal away the source of the moon's direct power, to seal away Kyle himself until the curse burned itself out across generations. Lyra listened with growing horror, understanding now the magnitude of the sacrifice he had made. He had willingly allowed himself to be imprisoned, had given up his life and his kingdom and everyone he loved, trusting that the priestesses would preserve his legacy and wake him when it was safe to return. Instead, he had awakened to find that everything he had built had been forgotten or corrupted, that the priestesses were gone, that werewolf society had devolved into the exact kind of oppressive hierarchy he had spent his life fighting against. The betrayal of it, not by any person but by time itself, was almost unbearable to witness. Kyle's hands were shaking slightly as he held his cup, and Lyra reached across the table without thinking, covering his larger hand with her own smaller one, offering what comfort she could. The mate bond flared at the contact, warm and reassuring, and she saw some of the tension leave his shoulders as he turned his hand over to lace his fingers with hers, accepting the connection they both desperately needed. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button. We have so many more tales of supernatural romance waiting for you. Over the following days, Lyra and Kale fell into an uneasy routine. She would leave before dawn to fulfill her duties at the pack house, returning in the evening with food and supplies while Kale remained hidden in the cabin, using the daylight hours to venture into the forest and reacquaint himself with a world that was familiar, yet alien. He was learning quickly, his ancient mind adapting to modern realities with impressive speed, though Lyra could see the grief that shadowed his every expression when he thought she wasn't looking. At night, they would sit by the fire and talk for hours, Lyra sharing everything she knew about current werewolf society, while Kyle offered insights from the old ways that often made her see her own world in a shocking new light. She began to understand how thoroughly the modern packs had betrayed the principles Kyle had established, how structures meant to support and protect had been twisted into tools of oppression and control. The realization was painful, but also liberating, because it meant that everything she had suffered wasn't her fault, wasn't evidence of her inadequacy, but rather proof that the system itself was fundamentally broken. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, the mate connection growing stronger as they spent time together, learning each other's stories and vulnerabilities. Kale was nothing like the alphas Lyra had known. There was no arrogance in him, no expectation that his strength entitled him to dominance over others. He treated her as an equal, despite the vast difference in their power levels, asked her opinion on matters both trivial and significant, and listened to her answers with genuine interest that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He was also surprisingly gentle, his touches careful and restrained even as she could sense the desire building between them, the mate bond urging them toward physical completion. He explained that in the old ways, mating was a sacred ritual that required preparation and ceremony, that rushing it would dishonor both of them and weaken the bond's potential. Lyra appreciated his consideration, even as her own inexperience made her nervous about what accepting the mate bond would ultimately mean. It was Kale who first suggested that they needed to address the seal on Lyra's wolf. He could sense the magical binding every time he touched her, could feel her wolf trapped and struggling, and he believed that with his power and knowledge of the old magic, he might be able to break whatever enchantment held her true nature prisoner. Lyra was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Because what if the seal existed for a reason? What if releasing her wolf revealed that she truly was defective, and the binding had been the only thing preventing some catastrophic flaw from manifesting? Kyle cupped her face in his hands, his golden eyes intense and certain, and told her that she needed to trust in the mate bond, that the moon would never gift him a mate who was anything less than extraordinary, that whatever lay sleeping inside her was meant to be free. His faith in her was absolute, unshakable, and Lyra found herself nodding agreement before her fear could convince her otherwise. The ritual took place 3 nights later, under the dark moon, when Kyle's power was at its peak, paradoxically. He explained that true alphas drew strength from the moon's absence as much as its presence, that the dark moon represented potential and transformation, making it ideal for breaking curses and seals. He led Lyra to a clearing near her cabin, drawing symbols in the dirt that glowed with silver light as his power activated them, creating a circle of protection that would contain whatever happened during the ritual. He instructed her to stand at the center, while he began to chant in the ancient language, his voice resonating with power that made the very air vibrate. Lyra felt his magic wash over her like warm water, seeking out the bindings on her wolf. And when he found them, his chanting faltered for just a moment, his expression darkening with anger. He told her the seal was recent, perhaps only a few years old, and it was not a natural binding but a deliberate act of sabotage. Someone had caged her wolf on purpose, had marked her as defective to hide what she truly was. The revelation sent shock coursing through Lyra's system. but she had no time to process it because Kyle's power surged, attacking the bindings with focused intensity. The seal resisted. Whoever had placed it had been skilled, but they were no match for a true alpha's might. Lyra felt the moment the bindings shattered, felt her wolf surge forward with joy and fury combined. And then she was shifting, but not into the incomplete half-form she had only ever managed before. Her body flowed like water into a new shape. And when the transformation completed, she stood on 4 paws for the first time in her life. Her wolf fully manifested at last. She was smaller than most. Pack wolves, but beautifully formed, her coat a pure silver white that seemed to glow in the darkness. And when she raised her head to howl her triumph to the absent moon, Kale shifted beside her, his own wolf form massive and black as midnight with those same golden eyes, and their voices joined in a harmony that spoke of joy and reunion, and the rightness of 2 souls finding each other across impossible odds. Comment below. If this moment gave you chills, we love hearing from you. When they shifted back to human form, Lyra was laughing and crying simultaneously, her body trembling with the after effects of her first true transformation, and Kale pulled her into his arms, holding her as she processed the overwhelming emotions. She could feel her wolf clearly now, a separate consciousness that was also intrinsically part of her, and the sense of wholeness was almost painful in its intensity. But beneath her joy was growing anger as she considered the implications of Kyle's discovery. Someone in the Silver Moon Pack had deliberately crippled her, had stolen years of her life, and marked her as defective, and the only question was why. Kale's expression was grim as he considered the possibilities, suggesting that if Lyra truly carried priestess blood, there might be those who recognized what she was and wanted to neutralize the threat she represented. The old bloodlines carried power that could challenge even the strongest alphas, and if the modern packs had built their authority on corrupted foundations, then a true priestess would be an existential danger to their control. The question of what to do next weighed heavily on them both. Kyle wanted to confront the Silver Moon Alpha directly, to demand answers and justice for what had been done to Lyra, but she convinced him that such a confrontation would end in violence that would help no one. Alpha Donovan commanded a pack of over 200 wolves, and while Kyle was immensely powerful, he was still one wolf. In an unfamiliar world, and she couldn't bear the thought of him being hurt or captured because of her. Instead, she suggested they gather information first, determine who had placed the seal and why, and only then decide on a course of action. Kyle reluctantly agreed, though she could see the alpha instinct to protect his mate warring with his tactical sense. He made her promise that she would not put herself in danger, that if she sensed any threat at all, she would run immediately back to him, and Lyra found herself oddly touched by his protective concern, despite her newfound independence. Lyra's investigation began the next morning when she returned to her duties at the pack house. But now she moved through the familiar spaces with new awareness, watching and listening with a clarity her wolf's freedom had granted her. She noticed things she had overlooked before in her misery and self-loathing, the way Beta Marcus watched her with an expression that might have been guilt, the way Elder Thomas would sometimes start to speak to her, then stop himself, as though remembering she was supposed to be insignificant. Most telling was Alpha Donovan's wife, Luna Catherine, who had always been coldly dismissive of Lyra, but now seemed almost nervous in her presence, her eyes tracking Lyra's movements with something that looked disturbingly like fear. When Lyra accidentally met her gaze directly while serving lunch, she saw Catherine flinch and look away, her heartbeat spiking in a way that Lyra's newly sensitive hearing detected easily. Something was definitely wrong, and Catherine was at the center of it. The breakthrough came 3 days later when Lyra was cleaning the Luna's private study and discovered a hidden compartment in the desk, triggered accidentally when she bumped against a decorative carving. Inside was a leather journal filled with Catherine's handwriting, and Lyra knew she should simply close it and forget what she had found. But her wolf pushed her to look, some instinct insisting this was important. What she read made her blood run cold. The journal detailed Catherine's growing obsession with maintaining her position as Luna, her fear that her failure to produce an heir would lead Donovan to take a second wife, or even replace her entirely. 2 years ago, she had sought out a witch who practiced the old magic, paying an enormous sum for a spell that would identify any potential threats to her status. The spell had pointed to Lyra, specifically to her dormant priestess bloodline, and the witch had warned Catherine that if Lyra ever awakened to her true nature, she could challenge not just Catherine but the entire pack hierarchy. So Catherine had paid for a second spell, the binding that caged Lyra's wolf and marked her as defective, ensuring she would never be seen as anything but the pack's shame. The journal entries were filled with self-justification, Catherine convincing herself that she had done what was necessary to protect her position and her marriage, that sacrificing one insignificant omega was a small price to pay for stability. Lyra felt rage building inside her, her wolf snarling for justice, but she forced herself to remain calm, to carefully photograph each page of the journal with her old phone before returning it to its hiding place exactly as she had found it. She needed evidence if she was going to expose what Catherine had done, needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or denied. When she returned to the cabin that evening, Cale took one look at her face and knew something significant had happened, and when she showed him the photographs and explained what she had discovered, his fury was terrifying to behold. His eyes flashed golden, his alpha power rolling off him in waves that made every wolf in the surrounding forest fall silent, and for a moment, Lyra saw the ancient king who had commanded armies and toppled tyrants. He declared that Catherine would face justice for her crimes, that no one who would deliberately harm an innocent to maintain power deserved mercy, and Lyra had to physically place herself between him and the door to prevent him from storming off immediately to tear the Luna apart. She understood his rage, because she felt it too. But she also understood that violence would only create more problems. If Cale killed Catherine, even justly, Alpha Donovan would have no choice but to challenge him, and the conflict would split the pack apart. Instead, Lyra proposed they take the evidence to the Regional Council, the governing body that oversaw disputes between packs and ensured alphas didn't abuse their authority. It was a long shot because the council was notoriously reluctant to interfere in pack internal matters. But with proof of Catherine's crimes and Cal's status as a true alpha, they might actually listen. Cal struggled visibly with his protective instincts, but eventually he recognized the wisdom in her approach, agreeing to try the political route before resorting to violence. He made her swear that if the council failed them, she would let him handle things his way, and Lyra agreed, hoping desperately it wouldn't come to that. Subscribe. If you're invested in seeing justice served, we promise this story delivers. The journey to the Regional Council headquarters took 2 days, traveling through territories Lyra had never seen beyond the Silver Moon borders. Kyle moved with confidence despite his unfamiliarity with the modern world, his alpha presence causing every wolf they encountered to instinctively defer to him, sensing something ancient and powerful that commanded respect without words. They arrived at the council building, a modern structure that seemed jarringly out of place in the forested mountains, and requested an emergency audience. The receptionist, a beta female, was initially dismissive until Kyle allowed just a fraction of his true aura to manifest, and suddenly they were being ushered into a conference room, with promises that a council member would see them immediately. The counselor who arrived 20 minutes later was an older alpha named Gerard, his silver hair and scarred face speaking to decades of experience, and his sharp eyes assessed them both with uncomfortable intensity. Lyra presented their case as clearly as she could, explaining Catherine's crimes and showing the journal evidence, while carefully avoiding any mention of Cale's true identity, introducing him simply as a traveling alpha, who had discovered her situation and taken her as his mate. Gerard listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as he reviewed the photographs. And when Lyra finished speaking, he sat back in his chair with a heavy sigh. He admitted that what Catherine had done was definitely illegal, that binding another wolf's nature without consent was considered a serious crime comparable to assault or attempted murder, and that the council would absolutely intervene if the evidence was authentic. However, he also pointed out the political complications. Catherine was mated to a powerful alpha who had significant influence in the region, and accusing her would create ripples that might destabilize multiple packs. He asked if Lyra would be willing to undergo a magical examination to verify the binding had existed and been recently broken. And when she agreed, he called in the council's resident expert, an elderly woman named Iris, who had studied the old magics and could read the traces such spells left behind. Iris examined Lyra for nearly an hour, her gnarled hands moving through complex gestures as she read the magical signature surrounding her. And when she finally stepped back, her expression was stunned. She announced that Lyra not only bore the traces of a powerful binding recently shattered, but that her magical aura identified her as carrying the bloodline of the lunar priestesses, a lineage Iris had believed extinct for over 5 centuries. The revelation caused an immediate uproar, Gerard demanding to know how this was possible while Iris circled Lyra like she was some priceless artifact, firing questions about her family history and whether she had manifested any priestly abilities. In the chaos, no one noticed Kyle until he stood, his movement fluid and commanding. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that made everyone in the room freeze. He declared that Lyra was under his personal protection, that he would not tolerate her being treated as a curiosity or a political tool, and that the council would address Catherine's crimes immediately, or he would handle the matter himself in the old way. Something in his tone, or perhaps the sheer force of his presence, made Gerard pale slightly, and Lyra saw recognition dawn in the counselor's eyes as he stared at Cale with growing disbelief. Gerard asked quietly who Cale really was, and after a long moment, Cale decided that secrecy served no purpose here. He revealed his true identity, explained how he had been sealed and recently awakened, and watched as the implications crashed over everyone present. Iris fell to her knees immediately, recognition and reverence in her ancient eyes, calling him by titles Lyra didn't fully understand. First Alpha, Moon's Champion, the Sealed King. Gerard looked like he might be sick, clearly understanding that the return of a true Alpha would completely upend the existing power structures, and his next words confirmed Lyra's suspicions about the state of modern werewolf society. He admitted that most of the regional councils had become corrupt over the centuries, that they served the interests of powerful alphas rather than protecting pack members, that the old ways Cale had established had been systematically dismantled because equality and mutual support were less profitable than rigid hierarchy and concentrated power. He suspected that if word of Cale's return spread, there would be alphas who would try to eliminate him before he could challenge their authority, that they would see him as an existential threat to everything they had built on the ruins of his legacy. The revelation was devastating, but not entirely surprising. Kyle asked bluntly if Gerard was one of the corrupt counselors, if he should expect betrayal the moment they left this room, and Gerard surprised them both by laughing bitterly and shaking his head. He explained that he was one of the few counselors who still believed in the old principles, who had spent decades trying to fight corruption from within with limited success, and that Kyle's return represented everything he had been working toward. He pledged his support immediately, offering to help Kyle navigate the political landscape and identify which alphas might be allies versus enemies. Iris likewise swore herself to Kyle's service, declaring that if a priestess bloodline had survived, then perhaps the old ways could be restored after all, that perhaps the 1,000 years of darkness could finally end. Lyra felt overwhelmed by the rapid shift in their situation, from 2 isolated individuals seeking justice to the foundation of a movement that could transform werewolf society. And when Kyle reached for her hand, squeezing gently, she knew he felt the same mixture of hope and terror about what lay ahead. The council moved swiftly once Gerard threw his support behind them. Catherine was summoned to the headquarters under the pretense of a routine administrative matter, and when she arrived 3 days later with Alpha Donovan at her side, she walked into a room containing not just council members, but also Kyle and Lyra, and the fear that flashed across her face was all the confirmation anyone needed of her guilt. The formal hearing was brutal in its efficiency, Gerard presenting the evidence while Iris testified to the magical binding she had detected, and Catherine's attempts to deny or justify her actions fell apart under the weight of proof and expert testimony. Alpha Donovan looked genuinely shocked, apparently having had no knowledge of his mate's crimes, and the betrayal and disgust in his expression when he looked at Catherine suggested their relationship would not survive this revelation. The council's judgment was swift. Catherine was stripped of her title as Luna, expelled from the Silver Moon Pack, and sentenced to 5 years of supervised exile, where she would undergo counseling and serve in territories that needed healers, perhaps learning through service what she had failed to understand about compassion and integrity. But the council's business with the Silver Moon Pack was not finished. Gerard announced that any pack whose Luna had committed such crimes clearly suffered from deeper problems, that the very fact Catherine had believed such actions necessary suggested a toxic hierarchy that needed addressing. He demanded that Alpha Donovan submit to a full audit of pack management. That council. Observers would be stationed in Silver Moon territory for the next year to ensure all pack members were being treated fairly, and that any wolf who had suffered abuse or discrimination would have the opportunity to bring formal complaints. Donovan bristled at the implication that his leadership was inadequate. But one glance at Cale, standing silent and imposing behind Gerard, was enough to convince him that resistance would be unwise. He agreed to the terms, though the resentment in his eyes promised future complications. If you're enjoying watching justice unfold, don't forget to hit that like button and share this story with friends who love supernatural romance. The question of what Lyra and Cale would do next hung heavy over their private discussions. Gerard offered Kyle a position on the regional council, suggesting that his presence and authority could help reform the system from within. But Kyle was reluctant to enter politics, feeling that his skills lay more in direct leadership than bureaucratic maneuvering. Iris proposed that Lyra train formally as a priestess, that she work to rediscover the lost arts and perhaps eventually teach others, rebuilding the sacred traditions that had been lost. Lyra was intrigued by the possibility, but also terrified, because she had no idea how to access whatever priestess abilities supposedly lay dormant within her, and the pressure of being potentially the last of her kind was immense. They discussed returning to the Silver Moon Pack, where Lyra could claim proper status, and they could work to reform the pack's culture from within. But the idea of going back to a place that held so many painful memories left Lyra cold, and Cal admitted he wasn't sure he could live peacefully among wolves who followed the corrupted systems he found so abhorrent. The solution came from an unexpected source. Elder Thomas, who had apparently been one of Gerard's contacts within the Silver Moon Pack and had been quietly fighting against Catherine's worst abuses, contacted them with a proposal. There was an unclaimed territory in the northern mountains, land that had once belonged to a pack that had died out 50 years ago in a plague, that remained empty because its harsh conditions and remote location made it unappealing to established alphas. Thomas suggested that Kyle and Lyra could claim that territory, establish their own pack based on the old principles, and create a living example of what werewolf society could be when it honored its founding values. It would be difficult, attracting members and building infrastructure from nothing, but it would also be free from the corrupted systems they both despised. A chance to start fresh and prove that the old ways could work in the modern world. The idea resonated immediately with both of them. The challenge of creation rather than the frustration of trying to reform something fundamentally broken. And after several long discussions about the risks and logistics, they decided to accept Thomas's proposal. The process of establishing a new pack was far more complex than Lyra had imagined. They needed to officially register with the regional council, stake their territorial boundaries, and begin recruiting members who would be willing to take a chance on an experimental community. Gerard smoothed the political aspects, using his influence to fast-track their registration, and even arranging for some initial supplies and construction materials to be delivered to their territory. Iris promised to visit regularly, to help Lyra explore her priestess abilities and provide guidance on recreating the old rituals. Most surprisingly, they received volunteers almost immediately. Wolves who had heard rumors about the true alpha's return and the promise of a pack built on equality rather than dominance. Some were omegas who had suffered under discriminatory hierarchies. Others were alphas who were disgusted by the corruption they witnessed in their own packs, and still others were simply young wolves looking for something different, some way of living that aligned with their ideals rather than crushing them. By the time Lyra and Kyle traveled north to their new territory, they had commitments from 20 wolves willing to join them, with more expressing interest pending the pack's successful establishment. The land Thomas had directed them to was breathtaking. a valley nestled between mountain peaks with a clear river running through its center and dense forests providing shelter and resources. The ruins of the old pack structures remained, stone foundations that could be built upon, and Lyra felt her wolf stir with satisfaction at the rightness of this place, as though something in the land itself recognized and welcomed them. Kyle stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, his expression more peaceful than she had seen it since his awakening. And when he turned to her with a smile that took her breath away, she knew they had made the right choice. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion they had been carefully restraining, and Lyra felt the mate bond flare between them, warm and right, and promising a future neither of them had dared to hope for. Their first weeks in the territory were a whirlwind of activity, as pack members arrived and work began on establishing basic infrastructure. They started with communal buildings, a large hall for gatherings and shared meals, and smaller cabins that could house families or individuals working together in a way that emphasized cooperation and mutual support. Kale led through example rather than commands, working alongside everyone else to clear land and construct buildings, and Lyra found herself naturally falling into the role Iris had described priestesses holding, mediating disputes, offering emotional support, and helping pack members navigate the adjustment to their new lives. She was surprised to discover that her priestess abilities were manifesting gradually, an enhanced empathy that let her sense emotional distress even from a distance, a talent for healing minor injuries with touch, and occasional flashes of intuition about the future that proved disturbingly accurate. Iris visited every few weeks to help her understand and develop these gifts, explaining that priestesses had been the heart of the old packs, the balance to alpha strength, and that recovering these arts would be essential to truly rebuilding the old ways. Not everyone was happy about their new pack's existence. Alpha Donovan made his displeasure clear through official complaints to the regional council, arguing that Kale was stealing his pack members and destabilizing the region. Other alphas began circulating rumors that Kale was dangerous, unstable, that his archaic ideas would lead to disaster, and that the council should shut down the experiment before it spread. Gerard did his best to shield them from the political attacks, but he warned that they would need to prove themselves quickly. That tangible success was the only thing that would silence their critics. The pressure was intense, but it also unified the pack in unexpected ways, giving them a common purpose and enemy that strengthened their bonds to each other. By the end of their third month, they had 40 permanent members, with another dozen in provisional stages, evaluating whether the pack's way of life suited them, and the community was functioning smoothly, despite the challenges. The moment that truly defined their pack came when a young Omega named Sage arrived at their borders, fleeing abuse from her birth pack and begging for sanctuary. She was badly injured, both physically and emotionally, bearing scars that made Lyra want to weep, and Kyle's fury manifest as a palpable force in the air. They granted her asylum immediately, and Iris worked with Lyra to heal her injuries, while other pack members provided support and comfort. When Sage's former alpha arrived 2 weeks later, demanding her return, claiming she was his property by right of birth, Kyle met him at the border with the full force of his true alpha power on display. He declared that no wolf in his territory would ever be treated as property, that Sage had chosen to stay of her own free will, and that if her former alpha had issues with that decision, he was welcome to challenge Kale directly for custody. The confrontation was tense, the other alpha clearly weighing his chances and finding them lacking, and he eventually retreated with dark promises of future consequences. But word of the incident spread rapidly through the regional community, and suddenly wolves from abusive situations began appearing at their borders, seeking the sanctuary and equality Kyle's pack represented. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. You won't want to miss what happens as this new pack grows. Within 6 months, their pack had grown to nearly 80 members, and they had established themselves as a viable alternative to traditional pack structures. Lyra had fully embraced her role as the pack's priestess, leading ceremonies that honored the moon and strengthened the bonds between pack members, and she had even begun training 2 other wolves who showed hints of dormant priestess bloodlines, suggesting that the old magic might be more widespread than anyone had believed. Kyle ruled with wisdom rather than force, establishing councils where pack members could voice concerns and participate in decision-making, proving that hierarchy based on mutual respect was far more effective than domination. Their success made them a target for continuing political attacks, but it also attracted allies, other council members who believed in reform, scholars who wanted to study their methods, and even a few progressive alphas who implemented similar changes in their own packs. The true test came when a coalition of traditionalist alphas, led by Alpha Marcus of the Iron Paw Pack, formally challenged Kale's right to lead, demanding he submit to the Council of Alphas and prove his pack's way of life through ritual combat. It was clearly a trap, an attempt to eliminate Kale and discredit everything he had built. But refusing would be seen as cowardice and would undermine their credibility. Kale accepted the challenge with cold determination, and the combat was scheduled for the next full moon at neutral territory. Lyra was terrified, not because she doubted Kale's strength, but because the combat would be 6 against 1, Marcus and 5 allied alphas against Kale alone. And no matter how powerful he was, those odds were brutal. But Kale reminded her that he had faced worse during his original reign, that he had defeated armies and tyrants, and that he would not fall to wolves who had forgotten what real strength meant. His confidence was absolute. And despite her fear, Lyra found herself believing him, trusting in the mate bond that assured her he would return to her. The combat itself was legendary, witnessed by over 300 wolves from packs across the region, and it lasted for nearly 2 hours as Kyle systematically dismantled his opponents. He fought with a skill and power that seemed impossible, his true alpha abilities allowing him to anticipate attacks and counter with devastating precision. And one by one the challenging alphas fell, or submitted, unable to match his superiority. When Marcus finally yielded, bleeding and broken, Kyle stood over him and made a declaration that echoed across the assembled crowd. He announced that any alpha who ruled through fear and oppression was welcome to challenge him, that he would face them all if necessary, but that the wolves of the region deserved better than the corrupt system that had governed them for centuries, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting to restore the old ways no matter how many battles it took. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some wolves cheering his words while others looked disturbed or angry. But no one could deny the legitimacy of his claim after such a decisive victory. The political landscape shifted dramatically after that combat. Several smaller packs approached Kyle about forming alliances, and a few alphas even stepped down from their positions, acknowledging that they had failed their pack members and asking Kyle to help establish new leadership based on merit rather than bloodline. The regional council formally recognized Kyle's pack as a model community and began using their methods as a template for reform initiatives across the region. Lyra found herself invited to speak at gatherings about the priestess traditions, sharing what she had learned with other wolves who were hungry for spiritual connection and meaning beyond simple survival and dominance. The movement they had started was growing beyond anything they had imagined, and while it attracted enemies, it also created hope for thousands of wolves who had suffered under the old corrupt systems. 2 years after Kyle's awakening, their pack celebrated its official establishment with a ceremony that blended old traditions with new innovations, and the entire valley filled with wolves from across the region who came to witness the event. Iris led the ritual portions, her ancient voice carrying power as she invoked the moon's blessing on their community, and Kyle stood with Lyra at his side. Their hands joined as they pledged themselves not just to each other, but to the vision they had built together. The ceremony concluded with their formal mating ritual, performed publicly as priestesses had once witnessed such bonds. And when Kyle marked Lyra, and she marked him in return, the power that surged between them was visible to every wolf present, a silver light that rose toward the full moon above as though announcing their union to the goddess herself. Lyra felt her wolf merge completely with her human consciousness, felt her priestess abilities bloom fully, and in that moment of perfect connection with Kyle and the moon and her pack, she understood that this was what the old ways had truly meant. This sense of wholeness and purpose and belonging that came from living in harmony with nature and each other, rather than trying to dominate and control. The years that followed were not easy. Change never is. But they were filled with progress and purpose that made the struggles worthwhile. Kyle and Lyra's pack became known as Moonhaven, a sanctuary for wolves seeking something better, and it grew to over 200 members within 5 years. Lyra discovered 3 more priestess bloodlines among the pack members and began formally training them, establishing a small temple where the old arts could be taught and practiced. Kyle worked with Gerard and other reform-minded council members to gradually change policies across the region, dismantling the most oppressive systems and holding corrupt alphas accountable. They faced opposition constantly, survived 2 assassination attempts, and weathered numerous political attacks. But they also built something real and lasting, proof that the old ways could work in the modern world if wolves were willing to commit to genuine equality and mutual respect. The most profound change came when other packs began requesting priestesses to help establish spiritual practices in their own communities, and Lyra's students traveled across the region, spreading the teachings they had recovered. The priestesses became a network that connected packs in ways that transcended political boundaries, creating a web of shared values and traditions that gradually undermined the corrupt power structures. Within a decade, nearly half the packs in the region had implemented significant reforms, and the regional council had been restructured to include priestess representatives alongside alpha leadership, restoring the balance that Kale had originally established 1,000 years before. The changes spread beyond their region as word traveled, and wolves from across the country began arriving to study Moonhaven's methods, hoping to bring similar reforms to their own territories. 15 years after Kyle's awakening, Lyra stood on the same rocky outcrop where they had first surveyed their empty valley. But now she looked out at a thriving community of over 300 wolves, at buildings and gardens and playing children, at a life they had built from nothing but faith and determination. She felt Kale's arms wrap around her from behind, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever, and she leaned back against his chest, with a contentment she had never imagined possible back when she had been the pack's broken Omega. He asked her if she had any regrets, if she ever wished things had been different, and Lyra considered the question seriously before shaking her head. Yes, she had suffered terribly before Kel's return, and yes, the years of building Moonhaven had been exhausting and often dangerous. But all of it had been necessary to bring her to this moment, standing with her mate overlooking a community that represented everything they believed in. She turned in his arms to face him, noting the silver threading through his black hair, despite his werewolf aging being slower than humans, the lines around his eyes that spoke of smiles and sorrows shared, and she thought he had never been more beautiful than he was right now, ancient and modern simultaneously, a king who had found his kingdom again in the most unexpected place. Their children, twin girls named Celine and Luna, came running up the path, arguing good-naturedly about some pack matter they were helping coordinate, and Lyra smiled at the sight of them, 13 years old, and already showing signs of the powerful priestesses and leaders they would become. They had Kale's golden eyes and Lyra's silver hair, and they moved through the pack with a confidence that came from knowing they were valued for who they were, rather than what rank they held. Behind them came a group of younger pack members, and Lyra recognized several who had arrived as damaged refugees from abusive situations, but now flourished in Moonhaven's accepting environment. This was what made all the struggle worthwhile, seeing wolves discover their true potential when given support and freedom rather than oppression and control. That evening, the pack gathered for their monthly full moon ceremony, a tradition Lyra had established that blended celebration with spiritual connection and community bonding. Hundreds of wolves filled the ceremonial ground, their various ranks and backgrounds mattering less than the fact that they had chosen to be here together, to build something better. Lyra led the ritual with her 4 fully trained priestesses supporting her, their combined power creating a silver glow that bathed the entire gathering. She spoke about the journey they had all taken, about the courage required to challenge unjust systems, about the responsibility of using strength to protect rather than dominate, and about the hope represented by each new generation that grew up learning the old ways. When she finished, Kyle stood and added his own words, acknowledging that he had awakened into a world he didn't recognize, but that the pack they had built together had given him a purpose he had never expected to find again. that each member represented the future he had sacrificed everything to make, possible 1,000 years ago. The ceremony concluded with pack singing, voices joining in harmonies that carried across the valley and into the mountains beyond. A sound of unity and joy that announced to the world that something new and old was growing here, something that refused to die despite centuries of suppression. Lyra stood with Kyle's hand in hers, their daughters pressed against their sides, and felt the mate bond thrumming between them, as strong now as the day it had first snapped into place in those ancient ruins. She thought about that frightened Omega who had stumbled into a forbidden temple, who had accidentally awakened a legend, who had discovered she was so much more than anyone had told her. That girl would barely recognize the confident priestess and pack leader she had become, but Lyra knew that every version of herself had been necessary, that even the suffering had shaped her into someone capable of standing beside a true alpha and helping him change their world. The path ahead still held challenges. The corrupt systems they fought were deeply entrenched and would not go quietly, but Lyra no longer feared those challenges because she knew they would face them together. She had found her mate, her purpose, her pack, and her power, and nothing would make her give up any of them. As the full moon rose higher and the pack's song reached its crescendo, Lyra closed her eyes and sent a silent prayer of gratitude to the moon goddess, who had guided her to that altar, who had preserved Kale through 1,000 years of sleeping, who had given them both a second chance at the life they deserved. And she knew with the certainty of her priestess gifts that this was only the beginning, that the old ways would continue spreading, that future generations would grow up in a world more just and balanced because of the foundation she and Kal had laid together, and that the love between them would endure as long as the moon continued to rise over there. Mountains eternal and unshakable and sacred,